As we know, Canada has detained and dispossessed a staggering 90% of the Canadian Japanese population, which was about 21,000 people at the time. And these people were put in this state for the rest of the Second World War. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, the Japanese Canadian homes and businesses were forcibly sold so that the government could pay for their own detentions. Even before the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese Canadian citizens were suffering from atrocious racism directed at them, which was evident in the country back then. Ever since the Japanese people stepped foot in Canada, they were considered as undesirables and were not given the same rights that other groups were. The Canadian government's racist notions banned Chinese people from working in mines, from voting, and generally established many restrictions on their well-deserved freedom. Unfortunately, when the tragic Pearl Harbor incident occurred back in 1941, the Japanese Navy Air Service attacked US naval powers, causing many casualties to many Canadian troops on board. With this, the Japanese-Canadian treatment became drastically worse within Canada's borders. After the tragic event, Japanese Canadians' distrust was further amplified and spread along the Pacific coast, solely due to the reckless anger and reaction of Canadian politicians after the incident. About 3 months after the attack, the Canadian government targeted Japanese Canadian groups when it ordered that all people be removed from any protective region within the country. This was acted upon the following week, and so the Japanese internment began. Japanese internment was quite brutal, as it caused severe suffering to many Japanese Canadians involved. In the first case of Japanese internment, women and children were put in livestock buildings as if they were some sort of caged animals, and took all the property which they could not carry. At the time, these internment camps were overcrowded and had no sufficient supply of electricity or cleaning water. I strongly oppose what the Canadian government did to the Japanese Canadians after the Pearl Harbor for various reasons. First of all, the Japanese Canadian citizens' presence in the country was of minuscule threat, as General Kenneth Stewart said, and such harsh reactions taken towards these groups of people were very unnecessary. The Canadian government should not have put the Japanese Canadians in internment, as they are rightful citizens of the country and deserve much better treatment. Canadian politicians were racist towards Japanese Canadians in the heat of the moment, and their reckless behavior unfortunately caused immense suffering to the Japanese Canadian citizens. Second of all, I think the way in which the Canadian government carried out the internment procedures were cruel and could have been handled in a much better way. Even if there was concern and suspicion of the Japanese Canadian people, the Canadian government should not have sold their homes and businesses, because these particular people were not at fault. And this was forever detrimental to the Japanese Canadians' quality of life, as it undeservedly stripped innocent people of their promising futures. The attack was mainly directed at US naval powers, meaning that the Japanese attacks were not initially directed at Canada in any way. The cruel actions which were undertaken by the Canadian government were simply unjust and could have been just as effective if different measures were taken. The Japanese Canadians are rightful citizens of Canada, and for them to be treated this way is simply unacceptable. As Canadian citizens, the Japanese Canadians should share the rights which are available to other groups of Canadian citizens. No citizen of any given country should even be treated this way within its borders, and the oppression which was evident by Canada towards Japanese Canadians is simply revolting.